Okay, so this is going to be our final chapter here in this DVD. And what we're going to do is put some lighting on our modeling, just to kind of skip ahead a little bit, see what it looks like when we got some shadows, some ambient occlusion, stuff like that. But before we do that, let's change the render back to default quality. And I'm just going to turn off some of this high poly geometry. And the next thing I want to do is pull up my modeling, and we're going to turn off the ambient occlusion that we baked to the vertices. And the way I'm going to make this happen is by right-clicking on a piece of geometry, going to my color set editor, and then under the display tab, if we select all, and then color and shaded display off, it will turn off that display of the baked ambient occlusion. So it didn't delete the bake that we did earlier, it's just turning it off. Alright, so now that that's out of the way, the next thing I want to do here is just find a camera angle that I think will be appealing for a render. And it really could be anything, but I'm just going to kind of shoot towards this arch here, which will be something similar to what we saw in the concept piece. And so now what I want to do is create a bookmark for this camera shot. So just in case we move the camera around, we can always return to this angle. And then once I've done that, let's go up here to our render settings, and we're going to switch from Maya software to Mental Ray. And then the next thing I want to do in this Common tab is make our preset a little bit larger, just so we can get a bigger render. So I'm actually going to create a custom width here, just to fill up as much of the screen as possible. And then once I've done that, I'm going to go up to the Indirect Lighting tab, and we're going to light the scene using Mental Ray's Physical Sun and Sky. And what this does is give our scene a basic lighting setup. And once it's in, you can go ahead and mess with stuff like the haze, the saturation of the scene, the overall brightness. I encourage you to play around with here. There's a lot of cool things you can do. It's just a real easy way to get a fast lighting setup in there. And moving on, I'm going to go to the Quality tab here. And under the Ray Tracing setting, I'm going to turn on Custom Sampling. And I'm going to boost these numbers a little bit just so we get a little bit of a better render here. And then the last thing I'm going to do in these render settings is go back to my Indirect Lighting tab and turn on Ambient Occlusion. Okay, so now that we've adjusted our render settings, the next thing I'm going to do is play with the angle of the sun. And I'm going to do that by finding the directional light that Mental Ray put into the scene to represent the sun. And I'm just going to rotate it a little bit so I get more of a dramatic angle. The default that it comes in with is usually pretty good, but in this case I'm just going to refine it a little bit more. And then go back to my bookmark here. The next thing I want to do is assign a material to all the parts. And since we're using Mental Ray to render this, I'm going to go into the Hypershade and assign a Mental Ray material to all the geometry in the scene. Now I could have just rendered out the scene with the Lambert material that's currently on the geometry, but assigning this Mental Ray material will look a little bit nicer because it has a specular highlight. So now that that's on there, you can see everything kind of changed to a little bit of a lighter gray. And now we're going to go into the material and mess with a few things. First off, we're going to take the reflectivity down, and then go to ambient occlusion and bump the samples up a little bit. We don't want to go too high because it'll take too long to render. And I'm going to make the distance a little bit smaller so we get a tighter ambient occlusion. And then finally, let's go back to our bookmark and then render the scene. Now this will probably take a few seconds to render, but I like to do this after I've finished my initial modeling just so I could see everything with shadows on it. It doesn't take a whole lot to set up a basic lighting rig like this. As you can see, we did it in just a couple minutes. And this gives you a good indication of how everything is looking, how the shapes are. And so really, if you do a few renders of your scene like this, and you're happy with the results, then you know once we finalize the scene with texturing, that it'll look even better. And so looking at this rendering, I think it came out pretty good. The shadows look nice, the shapes look big and heavy. And it really helps me get kind of excited about what the final result of the scene could be. So this is good practice to do, add some rendering in, just to double check everything one last time. And so with that, I think we'll go ahead and conclude this DVD. I hope that you've learned some stuff watching the way that I do things. I know I've gone over a lot of stuff, but I tried to pick the things that I felt would be most worthwhile. So anyways, I'm sure at this point you're sick of hearing my voice. And so thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time.